Greetings. Today I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about Chapter 6, Causation and Research Design. So this chapter addresses causal explanation, the criteria, and the cautions for causal explanations, research designs, determining causation using non-experimental designs, and units of analysis and errors in causal reasoning. So when we get to the whole idea of a causal explanation, we're really looking at an explanation for a particular characteristic or behavior or event. In essence, we're saying X, a particular variable, causes Y to occur, another particular variable. And what we'll find out is that we often are looking at really multiple causes to explain criminal behavior or rehabilitation or some other social phenomena. And you can see that there's two types of causal explanations, the nomothetic and the idiographic. And you can look at the differences there, and you'll see throughout that when we use more of the quantitative and then the qualitative approaches, there'll be a matchup somewhat with the nomothetic and the idiographic. But really, I think what's important is to start reading articles and analyzing them, critically account for what type of research is being constructed, how the researchers progress in their study, what tools they use, the measurements, the operationalization of variables, the sampling strategies, the data collection, the data analysis, their conclusions, and how that all fits together. Okay, in looking at the criteria for causation, there's three major requirements, really the requirements, that first the variables would need to be associated. There would need to be a relationship. In other words, they are related or vary together. And also, or secondly, there is a time order that the cause must come before the effect. And when we get into the research, we'll see that the independent variable is thought to lead to the dependent variable or the outcome variable. For example, if we were looking at, let's say, stress and violent crime are associated, that we see the higher the levels of stress, the higher the levels of violent crime. So we would say stress would be the independent variable, and violent crime rates, for example, would be the dependent variable. Of course, we can run into an issue with the time order problem, and we'll see that comes up again and again in particular studies. And also non-spuriousness. We have to rule out alternative explanations. One that's often used is that we know that ice cream sales is associated with crime rates. The higher the ice cream sales in a region, the higher the crime rates in a region. And so, and we can actually see that we might be able to see the association. We might even see that there's a time order requirement that's met, that we saw that ice cream sales were preceded the increase in the crime rates, for example. But then the non-spuriousness, well, is something else going on. We know that ice cream doesn't cause crime to increase, but we know that there is an association between crime and the weather, and also ice cream and the weather. And so we might find there's alternative variables that really explain, and when we bring in, for example, the temperature increase, we see that seems to be a driving factor more so than ice cream. You know, the same thing with storks and birth rates. The higher the rates of storks in the area, the higher the birth rates. Well, that's a spurious relationship, obviously. And then also mechanism and context are other variables that are relevant. So if we take a closer look, again, to review the association, the empirical association, that variation in one variable is related to variation in another. The relationship must also be observable, and the independent variable and the dependent variable must vary together. The time order factor, that the change in the independent variable must occur before the change in the dependent variable. And your authors do point out it's often difficult to basically establish or prove a cause-effect relationship because it's difficult to know which comes first. Obviously some would argue, well, back where high stress levels lead to high rates of violence, some might say high rates of violence lead to high stress level. Well, you get into that type of a scenario, you'll see. And the non-spuriousness of the relationship, that we want to rule out a third variable or other variables that may explain what's going on. And always your authors point out, remember, correlation does not prove causation. So just because variables are related doesn't mean that one causes the other. And then the mechanism is something to consider and to look at the process that creates the connection between the variables, and also the context or the circumstances surrounding the situation that we're observing. So, that's important. A lot of times we might want to look, sometimes in studies something happens. There's a fascinating study that was conducted. There was a study being conducted on post-traumatic stress disorder, and the researchers were following a group of people, and then 9/11, the terrorist attack occurred, and they were able to go ahead and follow up with those to look at post-traumatic stress disorder. And so they had an event occur that was unexpected, but because they already had started some research, they were planning to follow up with these people anyway, but now a big event, unexpected event occurred, so they had to consider that event and actually use that event as a focus on looking at how that effect or how the event may have influenced the post-traumatic stress disorder rates. And so we have different types of designs that we'll look at. We'll look at experimental designs and also non-experimental designs. With the experimental designs, we have the true experiments, and even though those are used in many disciplines, criminal justice often will use non-experimental designs simply because of the nature of the study, or what we're actually able to look at or control or set up in our study, especially when it involves crime. And so we're looking often at non-experimental designs, cross-sectional and also longitudinal. And there's three that are discussed in your textbook: repeated cross-sectional designs, fixed sample panel designs, and event-based designs. The true experiment, though, has several requirements. That first, basically, you have an experimental group that is getting some type of intervention or treatment, and then you have a control group that is not receiving that treatment or intervention. You also have the subjects randomly assigned to the groups to avoid biasing the selection of participants. So you have random assignment into the groups, and also the assessment of change in the dependent variable for both groups after the experiment has been conducted or the intervention or treatment has occurred is measured. So basically, in essence, you kind of have the traditional setup is that you have a group of participants. You randomly assign them to different groups. You could have multiple groups, but let's say you have one group that gets the treatment and another group that doesn't. So let's say you were looking at the effects of a treatment program to reduce drug abuse. And so you have a whole group of those that had been admitted or were caught using drugs, certain type of drugs. And so you have a treatment program, and you want to see if your treatment program is effective. And so you have 100 people, and so you randomly assign 50 to the group that gets the treatment and 50 that doesn't. Now, of course, right there, you're going to say, ethical issues, and that's certainly something to consider. You might find in many programs where they're strapped for cash, you have waiting lists. And so there may be people who you can study who can't even get into the program. And that's very unfortunate, really. But so you have random group assignment, and then you do maybe a pretest to look at the amounts of drugs they're using. And if you did random group assignment effectively, those should be pretty similar. Then you put one group through the treatment, the other group doesn't get the treatment, and then you measure after the treatment ends the drug use over a period of time. And it's actually probably a good idea to get multiple measurements, maybe right after the program, maybe 3 months down the road, maybe a year down the road. And that way you can assess not only if there's a short-term effect, but also if there's a long-term effect. That's kind of the true experiment setup. And so you can see again, the association time order, and also you'd have to consider the non-spuriousness of the relationship, and to make sure other things aren't happening with the control group. For example, what if they go across town, not only do they receive treatment, but they get paid, and so that motivates people, and so that confounds a lot of the findings that you'd have. So you have to really track things carefully. The non-experimental designs, the cross-sectional, basically that's kind of a snapshot at one time. And so, one of the things you can do, though, is sometimes you can use records to track things over time, and of course you can ask people to recall something that happened prior, but of course you run into memory issues and reliability, validity issues there. And then you have some longitudinal designs where you're measuring at different points in time. And so there's several studies there that you can read about, the repeated cross-sectional design or trend study, the fixed panel, for example, the cohort-based designs. And I think really the main thing you're looking at in the longitudinal studies is you're asking basically, you're looking at whether or not are you using the same people over time, or using different people, or you choosing a particular cohort to study that went through a specific event at a particular time. For example, you may be in a particular cohort based on when you graduated from your undergraduate degree, or if, for example, if you went into law enforcement when you attended the academy. I'm in that cohort of children that grew up in the 1960s and never learned how to dress nicely. So I mean that's kind of the idea there. And then also there's events that occurred that we could look at when we're looking at cohorts as well. And then you also, toward the end of the chapter, your authors throw in a couple of important ideas to take a closer look at. The units of analysis, basically. And so there's different units of analysis, and often we're taking a closer look there at you're studying individuals, are you studying groups, are you studying families, are you studying communities, are you studying particular crimes, sales of alcohol. So you want to identify your units of analysis in your study so you're clear on that. And then the authors talk about two fallacies, the ecological fallacy and reductionism. And the ecological fallacy is where a researcher comes up with conclusions about individual level processes from group level data. And an example of the ecological fallacy would be, let's say I'm doing a study in my community and I find out that there's a relationship between the divorce rate and the violence rate. And so all of a sudden I'm thinking, okay, well, divorced people must be violent. That's an ecological fallacy because I'm using total. I'm looking at rates at the aggregate level in the community. It might be that it's the married people who are committing a lot of the violent crimes, but there just happen to be a lot more divorces in the community. And the reductionism is kind of the opposite in that sense. So we want to stay with our basically, I guess, our level of measurements, groups to groups, individuals to individuals. And sometimes you'll see that often in the press, and politicians will present ecological fallacies or reductionism, where and usually we catch those errors, but you don't hear much about it. So those are some of the issues. And again, you know, what I would highly recommend is to read some of the articles that are linked through your student site on through Sage Publications. There's a whole bunch of interesting articles, and start looking at how researchers deal with this whole design of their study, their sampling, and you know, their thought process, and what they had to do. Were there special circumstances? Why do you think they selected that particular design over another? And I think that's probably one of the more useful ways to learn about research. Just read all the research studies that you can while always critically evaluating them. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.